thing for you guys to talk about a figure from American history who's been stunningly forgotten, like a guy who I literally didn't hear about even existed until about 3 or 4 years ago, and who I think is an incredibly interesting figure, and also one who ties into an entire emerging left-wing scholarship about the Civil War that we've actually had discussed on the show when our handsome socialist boy Matt Karp came on. And that is the emerging attempt by a group of scholars, Sven Beckert, Ed Baptist, Walter Johnson, and the aforementioned Karp, to upend the traditional Marxist understanding of the Civil War, your Eric Hobsbawms and your Eugene Genoveses, who claimed that the Civil War was essentially a brutally economic action by which the emerging bourgeois of the northern free states swept away the feudal vestiges of slavery in the South to make way for corporate capitalism as we now know it. That held sway for many years, even on the left, sort of like a dark mirror of the Dunning School lost cause fetish that dominated mainstream understandings of the Civil War until the 60s. In this version of the Civil War, slavery and the morality around slavery didn't really have anything to do with anything. It was really about the fact that the slave system of the Old South was not compatible with the emerging networks of capitalist trade that were coming into the scene thanks to the Industrial Revolution. But the new scholarship claims no. Slavery was incredibly dynamic. Slavery was incredibly profitable. And we look back and assume that slavery was essentially moribund and doomed because the South lost the Civil War. And a world in which the South was able to prevail and maintain its economy is one that we can't really conceive of, but one that might have changed the course of Western civilization in ways that we can't even imagine. And in this retelling, the Northern cause, the cause of union, was not merely, as has been repeated over and over almost catechismically, by generations of disaffected leftists, many of whom read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, a cynical exercise in state formation. The Republican political movement that elected Abraham Lincoln president in 1860 was animated by a genuine anti-slavery sentiment, and that the Union Army of the Civil War was a liberatory body that was doing sort of an almost unprecedented thing of acting in the interests of these bondage people. Now, that's a controversial point of view, obviously, and there's still plenty of people who argue, on the left, who argue in favor of the old sort of economically deterministic point of view, I guess you'd call it. But to what I'm going to I'll say that I'm broadly sympathetic to the new framework, but I think there's a figure from the Civil War who brings together a number of currents in historiography, but also in our dream of what America can be, to be really corny about it, but who has completely been forgotten by history. And so I want to talk to you guys today about him. I'm talking about August Willich, a Civil War general who also happened to be a member of the first generation of avowed communists to emerge from the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, alongside Marx and Engels and figures like that, who came to the United States, fought in the Civil War, had some pretty amazing encounters during the Civil War, and who stands as a figure of representation for an entire imagination of the Civil War as a revolutionary step, I guess you'd say, from the French Revolution to the American Revolution to the fights for labor and civil rights in the 20th century, as opposed to the Civil War just being one more sort of dreary movement in the displacement of feudalism by capitalism, which is, as I said, how it has generally been conceived of by even leftists in the 20th century. So I wanted to talk to you guys about him because I find him amazing and fascinating, and I genuinely was conceiving, before Chapo took off, I was conceiving of writing a biography of him until my absolute infacility with languages and my inability to internalize German to the point that I could translate it made it very difficult for me to continue with the project. I was thinking of writing a biography of this guy because there really is not an English language biography that covers his entire life, astoundingly, because to my mind, he's one of the most fascinating figures of both the revolutions of 1848 and also of the Civil War. So instead of sitting down and writing thousands of words and hundreds of pages that no one would likely read, I get to talk into a microphone to you guys about Willich. And maybe one of you, some bilingual history genius, will take it upon yourself to write that biography, because let me know. I would love to read it. So, August Willich, born in East Prussia in 1810 to a family of Prussian aristocracy. In fact, his father had been a hussar during the Napoleonic Wars. I think we all know what we imagine when we imagine the Prussian aristocracy. He would have been a perfect example of those rigid, upright men who went from their landholdings, their junker landholdings, into the Prussian military, sort of on the conveyor belt of sort of stations of the cross, I guess you'd say, of social advancement. But a funny thing happened with Herr Willich. Even though he was to the manor born, as it were, even though he was accepted as an artillery officer in the Prussian military, he resigned his commission in 1846 because somewhere along the way he had that magical Saul on the road to Damascus moment that many of us leftists have had, where he realized that the received wisdom of his class was a lie, and that there was another more emancipatory future to be had if people wanted it, and he wanted to be part of that. So he resigned his commission in 1846 and became an itinerant carpenter of avowed Republican convictions. And that's where he was when the revolutions of 1848 kicked off. And the revolutions of 1848 were sort of a signal moment in 19th century history, where people across Europe, from the German Confederation, France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, rose up in a series of rebellions against aristocratic rule and royalty and the vestiges of feudalism that Napoleon had been unable to sweep away. You can really kind of think of it as a Arab Spring without Twitter or Facebook. And when these rebellions happened, Willich made his way to the Palatinate and to the Rhineland, regions in southwestern Germany that were controlled by the Kingdom of Prussia, which he had been born into as a member of their aristocracy. And these people rose up in opposition to all forms of monarchy and all forms of inherited privilege. and they formed military units to defend their rebellion. Willich became a commander in one of those units. At the same time, Karl Marx, you guys might have heard of him, who had at that point been sort of exiled from Germany and was living in Belgium, came back to Cologne, Germany, to be the editor of a at this point, communism was in a proto-state, but he was editor of a magazine that was crucial in sort of generating the idea of what communism would be among this huge group of dissatisfied rebels of various ideological stripes. And while Marx was manning a printing press in Cologne, Willich was commanding a military unit to defend against Prussian incursion. And he ended up fighting several engagements against the Prussian military. By the way, his aide-de-camp and sort of first in command subordinate was none other than a young, red-faced, and incredibly enthusiastic Frederick Engels, who was actually booted out of one of the cities that he went to help with their defenses when he replaced sort of Republican flags on a barricade with red ones. That was seen as inflammatory, and he actually got booted out, and he got kicked around by a bunch of different groups before he ended up being the aide-de-camp to Willich. And they fought for a year or so to maintain these revolutionary formations in southwestern Germany until they were eventually basically crushed. And one of the reasons they were crushed is that many of these military groups were led by clerks and total dilettantes who didn't really know what they were doing. Willich is remembered in most correspondences about the 1848 rebellion as basically the only really capable and competent revolutionary commander. And the army he fought with in the Rhineland against the Prussians is thought to be the very first army in human history to fight under a red flag, as opposed to under the flag of a principality or nation. And that's significant considering what comes next. But even though Willich acquitted himself well, and Engels acquitted himself relatively well as his aide-de-camp, eventually they were defeated by the overwhelming power of the Prussians, and everybody who was a member of these revolutionary movements, from Marx to Engels to Willich, was forced to flee the continent. Most of them ended up in London. And it was in London where the next phase of August Willich's revolutionary life came to be. And it's actually very fascinating because he ended up in incredibly intense confrontation with Karl Marx. Because at that point, the inchoate revolutionary ideas that had been percolating during the 1848 revolution had crystallized into an idea of communism. Because remember that the Communist Manifesto, written by Engels and Marx, was written the very year that the rebellions began in 1848. So when Engels and Marx and Willich went to London, there was now an ideology to sort of organize around. And the organization that they organized with was called the Communist League. But if you're at all familiar with attempts among people on Twitter to arrive at some sort of ideological modus vivendi, you'll know that even though these guys were all basically on the same side, when it came down to the question of deciding on tactics and deciding on a program, they immediately butted heads. So the early 1850s, 1850 to about 1852, was a time where Willich and Marx and a bunch of other people, expats in London, were battling each other over control of the first sort of self-consciously communist organization in Europe called the Communist League. And they fought like cats in a sack over questions of strategy and ideology. One of the big ones was that Marx was a more methodical leader, a more academic and theoretical leader who wanted to build organizations within the matrix of politics as we understand it, whereas Willich was much more a sort of a precursor of the idea of individual violent action. I think if he'd been born a little bit later, he might have been one of the anarchists of the late 19th century who were fans of the propaganda of the deed, the idea of an individual making the decision to throw a wrench into the machinery of capitalism and allowing it to be destroyed through that. And they fought over these questions for a number of years. The most famous and amusing incident happened when Willich actually challenged Karl Marx to a duel. And Marx, being a bookish nerd who didn't want to get murdered by a trained Prussian military officer, declined. A young Marx protege named Schramm took up the glove and accepted the duel invitation, and Willich and Schramm took a boat across the English Channel to the continent where it was easier to duel without getting arrested, and in Antwerp held a duel. They stood paced across from each other, turned around and shot, and Willich, unsurprisingly, won. He put a bullet in the head of Schramm, who still survived, but was, as you'd understand, pretty fucked up by the experience. Around this time, the Communist League split into Willich and Marx factions. The two lobbied insults and accusations at each other, which all came to a head in 1853 with the Cologne Communist Trial. Or in 1852, I'm sorry. Where the Prussian government arrested 11 members of the Communist League who were still in Germany and charged them with participation in the uprising of 1848 using the information of a number of confidential informants both in Germany and among the expat community in Europe. Everyone was 7 of the 11 were convicted and sentenced to terms. Nobody was executed or anything, but it ended up being a watershed moment for the German expat community because Willich was basically implicated in having a friendship with a figure who was accused by many, including Marx, of being a police spy, and very well may have been a police spy who helped supply information that led to the convictions during the Cologne trial. Because the thing about the Marx-Willich confrontation in London is that Willich had a huge advantage among organizing workers in London in the very simple fact that, well, Karl Marx, in his personal life, fetishized bourgeois propriety. Him and his beloved wife, Jenny Westphalen, living in urban sort of bourgeois style with rented rooms and nice furniture and a hired maid who, parenthetically, Marx actually knocked up while Jenny was on the continent at one point. Which kind of put him in a remove from the workers of London. Willich actually lived in a workman's barracks in London during this time with a bunch of other expatriate German craftsmen, and that gave him sort of an advantage among the rank and file that Marx couldn't match. But the Cologne Communist trial gave Marx an opportunity basically to totally undercut Willich from that point on because, hey, fuck, You are hanging out with informants. Fuck you. And he actually published a pamphlet called The Night of Noble Consciousness, which was an extended teardown of Willich. It's actually pretty funny the degree to which early Marxist writing is about just clapbacks. Marx was like the original king of clapbacks. And a lot of his early writing is denouncing these figures who have basically been lost to history, like Max Stirner and Bruno Bauer and August Willich. And to a degree you can understand it because, well, we can look back and say, Marx, what are you doing? You're the figure who emerges triumphant as the theoretician of the 19th century. There is no way of knowing that at the time. I mean, the guy had a real interest in maintaining his position. So, but Knights of Noble Consciousness is one of many books and pamphlets that he wrote at the time trying to undercut rivals to his claim as leader of the emerging communist movement. And if you actually read Night of Noble Consciousness and you have any experience with Twitter arguments, it'll come to you in a flash what's going on. It's a classic exchange of accusations. You said this, but that's a lie. You said I said this, but that's a lie. I didn't say that. I said this, and you actually said this. Anyone who has ever involved themselves in a tedious Twitter spat about minute points of ideology or personal conduct will absolutely recognize what was going on. The actual details are incredibly mundane and meaningless, but the upshot is that because Willich could credibly be attached in personal relationships to someone who might have been an informant to the Prussian state, he was discredited, and shortly after the Cologne trial, he moved to the United States. It's actually an interesting counterfactual to imagine because Marx and Engels actually considered moving to the United States at this very same time. In fact, Karl Marx made an attempt to move to Texas that was foiled because while he was living in London, he was still a citizen of Prussia, and they would not give him permission to move, basically. They wouldn't give him the visa requirements necessary to go to the United States. They were planning to move to Texas, and I've always thought it would be a really interesting, historically counterfactual short story or novel to have Marx and Engels living amongst the German settlers of Texas of the 1860s, participating in an anti-Confederate guerrilla movement. Like Engels, who was sort of considered to be a military whiz and autodidact, playing the part of commander. Well, Marx is in a buckboard with a printing press, putting out inflammatory pamphlets. So anyone has that, anyone inspired by that, go ahead, go nuts. I think that'd be pretty good as a story. But anyway, while Marx was unable to move to the United States, Willich did. He moved to the U.S. His first stop was Brooklyn, where he worked at the naval yards using his carpentry skills. But after a short stint there, he moved to Cincinnati, where he became the editor of a German-language Republican newspaper called the Republikaner that sold the party line of the emerging Republican Party. And he was editor of that throughout the late 1850s. And during that time, he was active in both labor movements and also anti-slavery. Like any good communist, he was virulently anti-slavery. He shared the stage on a number of occasions with Peter Clark, who's basically like the first black socialist to reach any kind of recognition in the United States. He was a school teacher in southern Ohio. He went to Wilberforce University, and he was sort of a circuit-riding socialist orator in the very early era of socialism. And him and Willich shared the stage a number of times in Cincinnati after he moved there on the causes of abolition and also workers' rights. So that's where Willich is, plugging out the Republikaner when the Civil War begins. He had military experience, obviously, as a Prussian officer, and also having fought during the 1848 Revolution. Parenthetically, there were a number of people from the 1848 Revolution in Germany who moved to the United States afterwards. Franz Siegel, Karl Schurz, who ended up getting commissions in the United States military. Most of them were shitty soldiers, to say the least. They sucked. They were political appointees. They basically just fucking took up space. Willich, on the other hand, ended up being one of the best brigadier leaders of the Western theater. He had a number of innovations during his time in the Civil War. He taught his soldiers something called advanced fire, which is kind of fascinating because it totally went against military doctrine at the time. Instead of, as you'd seen if you've ever watched a Civil War movie, everybody standing in a line and firing and reloading and firing in a line, Willich taught his troops to do something called advanced firing, where one line of troops would fire, and then while they were reloading, the troops behind them would step forward and fire. And by that point, then troops who had fired would be ready to step forward and fire, so that while you were shooting, you were moving forward. This is something that he was probably taught when he was in the Prussian military, but totally unheard of in American military doctrine. And during his early days in the Union Army, he used it to his advantage. He also brought with him, as his army moved and as his troops moved, a kiln to make bread so that his troops would always have fresh bread. And he also conducted seminars on socialism to the largely German enlisted men who were under his command. So he was literally like sort of the model of the politically engaged military leader that you might see in like a Maoist text in the American Civil War. That's the thing to remember. And he ended up fighting in a number of really important, crucial engagements in the Western theater of the American Civil War. He was at the Battle of Chickamauga, where he was one of the units that held out with General Thomas at Snodgrass Hill to prevent a total Union rout after the absolute bungles of General Rosecrans. But most excitingly and most dramatically, his troops and him himself were there at the breaking of the siege of Chattanooga. This is, in my mind, one of the coolest, to use that kind of bloodless phrase, moments of the American Civil War. So, after the Union was defeated at Chickamauga, they retreated to the city of Chattanooga, at which point they were besieged by Braxton Bragg's Confederate troops. And during the siege, U.S. Grant, who had not yet gone to the east to fight with Robert E. Lee, came into the city to supervise the Army of the Cumberland. And he was there when they conceived of the decision to break through out of the siege. And what that meant was he essentially sent a bunch of troops out to clear the Confederates from something called Missionary Ridge, this low slope that was at one of the crucial points in the encirclement. And it was a complicated multi-stage military operation, but the first stage of which is that he sent troops to clear out rifle pits at the base of Missionary Ridge, and then to await basically reinforcements and further instructions. And Willich's troops were right there. And Willich was right there at the tip of the spear when they cleared out the rifle pits, which they did with ease because being pickets, there weren't a lot of troops there. But the problem was when they got there and they got into the rifle pits, they were getting shot at from the top of Missionary Ridge, and essentially, spontaneously, the troops made the decision that, well, we're not going to sit here and get shot at, we're going to move. And they basically followed the retreating Confederates who had abandoned the rifle pits up Missionary Ridge to its crown. And because they were right on the heels of the Confederates at the top of the ridge held their fire long enough that they were able basically to launch a devastating volley that cut through the first ranks, and then the Confederate Army basically broke and fled at that point. And there's a great anecdote where Willich, who was amongst his troops when at the very top when they did this, when they got to the top of Missionary Ridge, said, my boys, you are killing me with joy." So that was sort of the highlight of Willich's career. Shortly after that time, he was injured in the shoulder, and he spent the rest of the war supervising the defense of Cincinnati against any kind of Confederate invasion, which never came. And then after the war, he was a comptroller for Hamilton County in Cincinnati, and he was an officer of note in the Army of the Cumberland Veterans Group. But at that point, he had reached an age where I guess you could say the energy had kind of lapsed. Late in his life, in 1870, he traveled back to Prussia, where he actually volunteered his services for the Prussian military in the Franco-Prussian War. And because of his age and past communist associations, he was turned down. Then he returned to Ohio. He lived in a small town in sort of west central Ohio called St. Mary's, where he was a sort of local figure of color. He was a member of like a local Shakespeare society. He never married, never had children. A number of historians have come to the conclusion that he was actually gay, although, there's no smoking gun on that. But he ended up dying in 1878 at the age of 67 and was buried in St. Mary's, Ohio. So, with a solo sode for everybody who likes solo sodes. It's another Inebriated Past. And tonight, after much consultation with the Twitter fans about what would be a good follow-up to my August Willich episode, the resounding answer was, talk about the sewer socialists of Milwaukee. Why wouldn't I? I am a Wisconsinite by birth and by habit, and as such, I have a deep affinity, a visceral affinity for the sewer socialists from Milwaukee from the turn of the 20th century. And so I say to you, yes, let's talk about the sewer socialists, especially since we are now in an era post-absolute boy conquering in the UK, where genuine left-wingers can ask themselves, what would socialist management mean in the core capitalist countries of which most of us are residents? So I don't think there's a better cautionary tale and inspiration than the sewer socialists who governed Milwaukee in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And I feel like talking about them is going to elucidate a lot of issues about power and about how it's wielded by those who seek to radically transform the status quo, but who also have made the concession to seek electoral remedies. And that's what we're talking about here. Just as we see Jeremy Corbyn, the absolute boy, triumph in England, the question is, well, what does that mean? How can a electoral power work against capitalism's worst manifestations without being co-opted by capitalism? And the answer to that, I think, can at least partially be found by looking at the sewer socialists. So let's start in the late 19th century. After the Civil War, you saw a solid 30-year period in America where capital and labor fought to a degree that is basically unmatched in any other Western country. There's no other country that you can point to that had a bloodier labor history than late Victorian America. We're talking about the Homestead strike. We're talking about the Pullman strike. We're talking about the Ludlow massacre. We're talking about the swelling of agricultural socialism that came to form the Populist Party, which was so popular in the Western United States that the Democrats essentially absorbed their entire platform when Eugene V. Debs ran for president in 1896 and in 1900. So out of this cauldron, basically, of socialist agitation, we see a number of divergent ideas about how to advance the working class in America. The most conservative of which is Samuel Gomper's American Federation of Labor, which saw the goal of the labor movement as organizing around trades, around skilled workers who had specific abilities that could not be filled by any random person off the street, and as such could leverage those abilities to get a living wage and the ability to sustain themselves and their families based on their wages from work. That's sort of the most right-wing component of the labor movement. But at the same time, you saw a huge explosion in electoral socialism. People who were inspired by the socialist parties of the emergent working class in Europe at the same time. The thing to remember about Europe is that in the late 1800s, you were seeing the emergence simultaneously of a self-conscious working class and a universal manhood suffrage. And the leading proponent of that would be the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which took Karl Marx's analysis and compiled it into a theory of power revolved around electoral success. Basically, the people who took the baton from Marx in Germany said, look, we have the numbers. Laborers are the majority, or will certainly soon be the majority of German people, and as such, we should just cultivate their political participation to the point where they can essentially vote socialism in. And a lot of Americans took that to heart. And in the late 1800s, you saw an explosion of socialist parties who warred over the questions of tactics and strategy. The most sort of doctrinaire Marxist would be Daniel de Leon, who was the head of the Social Democratic Labor Party and who constantly sort of pushed away more pragmatic socialist comrades in the pursuit of a sort of a purely Marxist agenda of stagist reform leading to revolution. But all of this argument sort of came to naught because, and then, as I said, on the end of that spectrum, you had direct actionists and anarchists, the people who were hanged at Haymarket in 1888, people who said, that accommodating capitalism is a fool's errand. It will end only in co-optation and defeat for your goals. You can only win by destroying capitalism. And that is where you saw the birth of the genuine conflict that would flower in the 20th century. But the important thing to note is that in 1901, all of these disparate strands of American socialism came together in the formation of the Socialist Party of America, the first comprehensive, all-inclusive Socialist Party America ever saw. And this party had deep influence and resonance in huge swaths of the country. A lot of the agricultural workers who had flocked to the Populist Party in the late 19th century and then saw the Populist Party essentially dissolve when its platform was absorbed by the Democrats and its candidate, William Jennings Bryan, was absorbed by the Democrats, it gave them something to move forward to as they saw the Democrats fail to live up to the promise of that emulsion. And then, more importantly, in urban areas across the United States, immigrant communities embraced the Socialist Party because they were coming from parts of the world, specifically Europe, where socialist parties were the norm and where socialism was not a dirty word. It was not anti-American or whatever that meant in the old country. And as such, they were super accepting to the idea. And so we saw a flowering of socialism in the urban centers that were dominated by European immigrants. A good example of the trajectory we're talking about is that Eugene Debs, who was the leading light and presidential candidate of the early Socialist Party, made his national name during the Pullman strike of the 19th century, in which railroad workers struck against the Pullman company for reduction in wages and layoffs. And he was imprisoned at one point for his actions as a railroad union executive. And while in prison, he read up on socialist theory and came out of prison a committed socialist, so that by the time the Socialist Party was formed in 1901, he was there and ready to lend his name to it once that moment came. So the date, the year that can kind of be, there was a lot of conflict and argument in that early Socialist Party mostly over tactics, about whether one should adhere to a purely electoral line or whether one should fight more for industrial sabotage and direct action and the sort of anarchist-inflected stuff that would later be personified by the industrial workers of the world, or whether, and that argument persisted. And another argument was about questions about immigration and race and gender. And these are all questions that threaten to splinter the early solidarity of the Socialist Party. But the year that saw the first big breakthrough for socialist electoral politics in America was 1910. 1910 is the year that in the city of Milwaukee, the mayor, Emil Seidler, was a socialist. One of the members of the House of Representatives, Victor Berger, was a socialist, and the majority of the city council was socialists. And that is the year that you saw, for the first and only time in American history, a preponderance of socialist politicians in a specific municipality. Socialists were elected across the country as mayors, as legislators, both statewide and municipally. There was a socialist member of Congress from New York. But only in Milwaukee was the entirety of municipal and federal government under the control of socialists. The main reason for this is that socialism was not a dirty word to the German immigrants who made up the majority of the Milwaukee population. There was a big outward bursting of reform energy throughout the country, but it differed depending on the ethnic upbringing of the person having it. For example, Wisconsin was also the home to the progressive movement of Robert La Follette, which was a splinter movement from the Republican Party of Theodore Roosevelt, but more aggressively committed to the ideas of nationalized resources and nationalized infrastructure, more hostility to concentrated wealth. But progressivism more appealed to middle-class Yankees, people of long American extraction. Socialism, with a big S, was much more appealing to people who had recently come from Europe. And as such, Emil Seidler, the first socialist mayor of Milwaukee, was son of the German immigrants. Victor Berger, who in 1910 was elected as a member of the House from Milwaukee, was an Austrian Jewish immigrant. These are the people who formed the sort of basis of the catalyst for socialism in Milwaukee specifically, because the immigrants who made up the population of Milwaukee were in some ways sort of inoculated against the flag-waving jingoism that mitigated against socialist awareness in other parts of the country. So these people who were elected in 1910 form the basis of what would later become known as the sewer socialists, called that because they did not occupy themselves with questions of revolution and overthrowing capitalism so much as the narrow questions of administering a municipality in the most rational and effective way possible. It was a non-utopian socialism. It was pitched to people basically as common sense. You have gutters overflowing with garbage in your city? Socialize that shit. Why should you have to pay a person to come and take the garbage away from the front of your house when we could all collectively pay, and then someone who we had collectively hired would come every fucking week and take the same garbage away? Why deal with sewers that backed up and got clogged and sent shit everywhere when you could socialize the sewers, have everyone pay into a common pot, and then have that money go towards sanitation? That was basically the pitch of the sewer socialists. It was, we have all these problems created by urbanization. Because there is no overarching planning dealing with them, they go undealt with. People are left to their own wits to make these decisions and to solve these problems. How much easier would it be if we were to come together and pool resources to solve these problems in such a way that it wasn't up to the individual citizen to fix them? We could all agree to put into a common pot and have the result of that being the rational elimination of things like waste, the public bus system that allowed infrastructure and travel. Why don't we do that? So that is the thing about the sewer socialists, is that they were pragmatic beyond all. They did not speak of grand concepts of a post-capitalist world. They said, you've got garbage in your gutters. You've got overflowing sewers. We can help you with that. And that is what led to their electoral success. But, and this is the most important point, it also limited them in very significant ways. and made it difficult for them to put forward a vision for society that went beyond relatively quotidian questions of municipal administration. For example, the first socialist mayor of Milwaukee was, as I said earlier, Emil Seidel. He was elected in 1910. He defeated a Democrat and a Republican in a three-way race. Then in 2012, he ran again for re-election, and the Democrats and Republicans agreed to run one candidate against him, which, parenthetically, is a huge tip-off to potential left-wing challengers to the status quo, is that party means nothing. Ideology means everything. The Democrats and Republicans instinctively understood that they had more in common with each other than either of them did with the Socialists, and as such, they were fine with finding one candidate to run against Seidel, and he was defeated in 1912. So as I said, Emil Seidel lost his re-election bid in 1912 because the Democrats and the Republicans came together to run one candidate against him who defeated him. But socialist administration in Milwaukee was restored in 1916 with the election of Dan Hoan, Hoan, who became the longest-serving mayor, the longest-serving socialist mayor in American history. He served from 1916 until 1940. And this looks like a socialist success story, right? Look at this. This guy ruled for over 20 years. It's amazing. He socialized things like housing. The first public housing in America was initiated under Hoan's administration in Milwaukee. Municipal sewage, municipal water purification, a municipal quarry, and most importantly, the elimination of the sort of urban corruption that was associated with the Democratic and Republican machines that preceded socialist power. That's an underspoken of element of socialism's rise in Milwaukee, is that in urban areas before the turn of the century, administration of vital municipal activities was basically divvied up by political machines, people who had connections to private powers that were outside of government and who were basically bribed into supplying individual purveyors with access to a public fund or another. Socialists, one of the big appeals of them was that they were not connected to any of these pre-existing patronage organizations. And as such, they could run on purity and on anti-corruption. And Hoan absolutely did. And he was elected in 1916, as I said, and he ruled all the way until 1940. And as I said, looks like an amazing story of socialist conquest, except for the fact that in 1917, the United States entered World War I. And socialists in America were confronted with the exact same issue that socialists in Europe were confronted with in 1914. What do we do about our claimed adherence to working class internationalism? At the time of the beginning of World War I, there was something called the Second International. It was the inheritor of Marx's First International Working Men's Association, and it was made up of socialist parties from across Europe and the United States, all of whom adhered to the idea that class loyalty was far more important than national loyalty, that the average working man or woman had way more in common with working men and women of other countries than either of them did with the ruling class of their own country, and that they would not fight against one another in any kind of imperialist-driven war. But then Franz Ferdinand got in Sarajevo in the summer of 1914, and all of it went to the wayside. Basically, every socialist party in Europe threw away their internationalism and voted to join the war effort of their respective countries. And this is basically the death knell of international socialism in the early 20th century. What emerged after the end of the war was basically a zombie animated by the corpse of the quasi-socialist Russian CCCP. But any kind of hope of an international socialist movement opposed to empire and opposed to capital was destroyed in 1914 when every socialist party across Europe decided to endorse the war effort. The exception to that was the American Socialist Party that we spoke of, led by Eugene Debs. They said unequivocally that war is not the answer. And Victor Berger, who had been elected to Congress in Milwaukee in 1910, was arrested and imprisoned for his opposition to the war. This is a man who, in many respects, was sort of a nightmare of accommodation. A man who had said that the way to socialism in America foreclosed direct action, foreclosed any kind of genuine workforce militancy, which is why he was one of the people who in 1912 pushed out Big Bill Haywood and the IWW sympathetic members of the Socialist Party and kicked them out of their Central Committee. A man who endorsed the racial stereotypes of the day and the racial animus of the day, saying that socialism was a way to build white workers' power, hostility to foreign-born workers, and also to black workers coming to the North from the American South. But when it came down to the question of should the American Socialist Party endorse war in Europe, he was steadfast in saying no, as was Eugene Debs. But not part of that was Dan Hoan, mayor of Milwaukee, who endorsed the war effort and, in fact, oversaw municipal bond buying activity. So the price, essentially, of Hoan's continued stewardship of the city of Milwaukee was his abandonment of socialist internationalism. Meanwhile, Victor Berger was arrested under the Espionage Act, as was Eugene Debs. And in 1920, Berger was basically kicked out of Congress due to his opposition to the war and the fact that he had been convicted in a court of the Espionage Act. And the people of Milwaukee voted him back in 1920, and the seat was vacated by rule of the U.S. House of Representatives. They said, we will not accept anybody from Milwaukee if they have been convicted of a crime. And Victor Berger had been convicted of the crime of opposing the war. And a Republican took the office in 1922. Eugene Debs was similarly imprisoned at the same time for his opposition to the war. And the speech he gave before being sentenced still is famous among socialists as sort of a cri de coeur. And even though it's parenthetical to the issue we're talking about, I just want to quote it because of how powerful it is. He says, quote, "Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest of earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." So he got thrown in jail by Woodrow Wilson, as did Victor Berger. After the war, both Berger and Debs' sentences were vacated. Debs by presidential fiat, Berger by Supreme Court decision. And Berger took his seat back in 1924 after it was held for a brief 2 years by a Republican. And so in the 20s, you saw Berger in power in Washington and Hohen in power in Milwaukee proper as mayor. And they worked together to turn Milwaukee into sort of a laboratory of socialism, where they made public many elements of administration that at the time were thought to be the province of private industry, but which now we look back on and we think, well, of course those should be municipal. Things like sewage, of course that should be owned by the municipality. That was pioneered by the sewer socialists of Milwaukee. While Berger was in office, he promoted things that we take for granted as liberal ideas, but what at the time were considered to be radical. Things like an old age pension. Victor Berger introduced the first bill to give old people a pension, which we would now think of as Social Security, in America. And I think what is important about that is that it shows that while libs love to talk about how every progress in American history is the product of centrist liberal negotiation, in reality, if you actually look at the process by which progress has been made in America, at every point you have bleeding edge radicals, and in this case socialists, making a case that would otherwise be unspeakable, and then over time that case being absorbed by sort of the center left as embodied by the Democratic Party. But without that agitation and without that effort, those things never would have happened. So every complacent lib who tells you that the 8-hour workday and child labor laws and Social Security are the product of good old-fashioned centrist democratic movements, we know for a fact that is not the case. In every case, they were pushed into the public conversation by radicals who were not afraid of that label, and that Democrats, the broad center left, only absorbed them later as a way to mollify the most obstreperous members of their left flank of their party. And as such, the only reasonable conclusion to draw is that the Democrats are essentially a useless pass-through organ that should be overtaken and consumed by a party that is committed to these ideas from the first and doesn't have to do some sort of horrible negotiation to decide that they're viable. But what the sewer socialists teach us is that such compromises to become viable in an electoral sphere are dangerous, because what the sewer socialists ended up becoming after all of this effort and after all this fighting was basically a municipal movement towards a rationalized public administration of infrastructure. The foreclosing of utopian horizons that was part and parcel of the sewer socialist vision that Victor Berger personally absolutely adhered to. Throughout the 20s, he fought at every instance to tamp back revolutionary and radical currents within the Socialist Party, especially after the October Revolution of 1918, when you saw the breaking off from the Socialist Party of the Communist Labor Party and the Communist Party, who eventually came back together under Comintern aegis, but which were absolutely fought at every turn by people like Berger, because they saw a reformist road and they wanted to pursue the reformist road. But looking back at the achievements of the sewer socialists, we see the limitations more than anything. The accomplishments are without argument. The promotion of the idea of municipal control over local infrastructure, which has been fought back and forth over the 20th century, but which I believe is still considered to be a mainstream view, that local municipalities should have control of local infrastructure. But by foregoing the revolutionary path, by accommodating oneself to electoral gains only, the sewer socialists essentially condemn themselves to obsolescence. The real story of that is that Emil Seidel, the first socialist mayor of Milwaukee, who served from 1910 to 1912, came back to run for mayor again in 1948 against the socialist Frank Zeidler as a Democrat. Zeidler won and continued the tradition of socialist mayoralship in Milwaukee until 1960, from 1948 to 1960, which is something that people steeped in the Red Scare would have a hard time imagining. Yes, it's true. An American city of significant population was governed by an admitted and proud socialist throughout the 1950s. But although Zeidler loudly proclaimed his allegiance to concepts of civil rights, the black diaspora movement towards Milwaukee throughout the 40s and 50s did not involve an integrated and enlightened population dispersal. Instead, the black population of Milwaukee was ghettoized into a very small section of the northern part of the city, even while the mayor of the city was a professed socialist and professed advocate for civil rights. And in fact, Zeidler's decision to not run for re-election in 1960 was largely dictated by his belief that he would not be able to argue in favor of a pro-civil rights administration in the face of white panic, essentially. And even though Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had the longest term of socialist administration of any American city in the 20th century, it now, at the dawn of the 21st century, has the highest levels of racial segregation in the country. So that, I think, is the real lesson of the sewer socialists. As much as we might find heart in their robust programs of municipal administration, their anti-corruption moves, their willingness to state unequivocally their desire to see a communal administration of wealth, the city that they administered did not live up to that idea for the very same reasons that socialists were able to take power, which is that the accommodation required to take power fundamentally undermined the socialists' ability to govern in a genuinely radical way. So I would say to all of the people giddy with the amazing, miraculous success of Jeremy Corbyn in the recent snap election in Britain, to look at the history of the sewer socialists and to think about what it means in the 21st century for socialist administration to be both a viable, practical thing that appeals to people's bread and butter dinner table desires, but that also holds out the hope and the mechanism for genuine revolutionary change. Because the sewer socialists, at a certain point, essentially accepted that the best that they could hope for was a incremental increase in public control over infrastructure and housing and things like that. But that the fundamental contradictions of American life were greater than anything that they could have conceived of, and that they overwhelmed the sewer socialists' desire and efforts for change. We are a people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit. Those are the opening words of the Port Huron Statement, the coming out document of the Students for a Democratic Society, which was composed of a number of college students and radicals who had decided that they needed to do something to reinvigorate the American left, which by the early 60s was essentially moribund. Now, the U.S. had had a vibrant and often violent and quite radical labor tradition leading all the way from the late 19th century to the 1930s, but it had essentially been neutralized by the early 60s by a carrot and stick approach. The carrot being the co-optation by the Democratic Party and Franklin Roosevelt, the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, and then after World War II, the labor peace that was essentially hashed out between the major unions and large American industry, specifically the auto industry, where the unions would be guaranteed a seat at the table and a significant share of the bounty of America's post-war economic boom, coupled with the absolute terrifying stick of McCarthyism and government suppression. After World War II, the combination of the Red Scare in Washington and the resultant terrified effort by labor leaders to root out any kind of communist influence meant that the vanguard of the American labor movement, the ones that had pushed forward and gained the dramatic advances and victories that they had in the previous 20 years, were all purged in an effort to conform to the post-war order in which communism had replaced the Axis powers as America's great enemy. And what that meant is that by the time the first group of Students for a Democratic Society met in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to propose a new organization, there was no militant left in the United States. The people who had been in labor movements, the people who had filled the radical union halls and had the membership rolls of radical political parties like the Socialists and the Communists, had essentially been bought off. They were captives to the same fantasy of eternal American prosperity as the rest of the country after World War II, when the fact that the U.S. was essentially the only major economic power left and the industrial heartland for all of the rebuilding nations, it meant that sense of militancy and edge that had predominated during the radical 30s, the years of the Depression, was totally disarmed. People felt like they were doing very, very well, at least obviously white people. And because of America's racial caste system, the more heavily felt dissatisfaction and growing militancy in America's black communities was not connected to any kind of greater movement. So with the American left as a labor movement essentially neutered, no longer in the streets, no longer agitating forward, comfortable to embrace the sort of Eisenhower steady state of fat union paychecks and guaranteed weekends and quarter acre lots in the suburbs, there was no more energy for fomentation. So a bunch of young radicals met for the first meeting of the Students for a Democratic Society in 1962. Now, actually, they were the outgrowth of a bunch of organizations that had existed since the turn of the century, but were looking towards universities as the new place to sort of build an American left now that the
white working class was essentially bought off by and scared off by capital. So at that first meeting, a bunch of radical students penned what became known to history as the Port Huron Statement.
Tell me about yourself, Jeffrey.
I was one of the authors of the Port Huron Statement, the original Port Huron Statement.
Uh-huh.
Not the compromise second draft.
And the Port Huron Statement is a document that is very much of its time. It is, for example, there's a line in it where they complain that most college students are complacent and they're more interested in the twist than in engaging with politics. So, and basically you can imagine that, just like replace the twist with like selfies. And it's the same thing with people complaining about like their fellow lazy millennials or whatever. So the Port Huron Statement is an outline of a bunch of middle-class white kids, basically, who were horrified by a nation that seemed incredibly self-satisfied, but at the same time was riven by real ills and a horrifying racism. And it seemed, honestly, to just be sort of sleepwalking into a nuclear apocalypse with its Cold War brinksmanship with the Soviet Union. So these kids essentially wanted to wake America up and recreate the sense of social urgency that had presided before World War II, before this complacency had set in, that was the result of America's hegemonic economic position in the post-war world. They complained about nuclear war. They complained about Jim Crow. They complained about an American population that was no longer engaged politically, didn't really think that there could be horizons, didn't think in any kind of utopian or even idealistic sense, only felt apathy and sort of an understanding that the world they had inherited was the only world they could have and that there was no changing anything. And they proposed a program of re-emerging democracy, essentially. The idea of every person in America feeling a common purpose and a desire to engage each other on a democratic, horizontal, political footing. And the document, as a result, feels very much like everything you could find out about the New Left and the way that it sort of ended up turning into this sort of weird quasi-libertarianism. It's in the document. It's in the Port Huron Statement. There's very much an emphasis on people's personal moral duty to the country and to each other, and the need to basically reinvigorate a sense of civic responsibility more than anything among the population. Not a lot of talk of class. They don't want to be militantly anti-communist the way that the rest of the American left at that point was very much neurotically so. But they also didn't want to adhere to any of the quote-unquote tired slogans of the old left about class war. There's very little talk of class in the document. And it basically just says America's fucked up, racist as hell, militaristic, capitalist to the point that it is destroying communities and sense of fellow feeling. And we want to change that. And we feel like the place to do that is America's colleges. They lay out the sense that in the university is where the future of the American left is. And this is why they say that universities are the place to reinvigorate the American left and find the people who are going to change the country. First, the university is located in a permanent position of social influence. Its educational function makes it indispensable and automatically makes it a crucial institution in the formation of social attitudes. Second, in an unbelievably complicated world, it is the central institution for organizing, evaluating, and transmitting knowledge. Third, the extent to which academic resources presently are used to buttress immoral social practice is revealed first by the extent to which defense contracts make the universities engineers of the arms race. Two, the use of modern social science as a manipulative tool reveals itself in the human relations consultants to the modern corporations, who introduce trivial sops to give laborers feelings of participation and belonging, while actually diluting them in order to further exploit their labor. So basically they feel like the universities are the place where America's cultural mindset is fashioned. And in that, they certainly weren't all wrong. But it made them decide that the place to find the left in the post-New World order of the 60s was going to be the universities. The last line of the Port Huron statement is, the last two lines are, as students for a democratic society, we are committed to stimulating a kind of social movement, a kind of vision and program in campus and community across the country. If we appear to seek the unattainable, as it has been said, then let it be known that we do so to avoid the unimaginable. So that is the cri de coeur of this young generation, small group of very earnest young idealists who want to change American society. And their first few years were filled with attempts to do so. There were attempts to reach out to racial justice organizations like SNCC and CORE. There were attempts to organize with anti-war and denuclearization activists. And there was even an attempt, a botched attempt, to reach out to the white working class, basically sort of a neurotic mission to the urban white proletariat and try to engage them in political activism, which didn't really work out. And then by 1965, the free speech movement, which was happening in Berkeley, where students protested the removal of core pamphleteering stations in one of their outdoor public areas, and led to a huge showdown with the Berkeley police and the birth of this concept of radical free speech on campus, which, of course, Milo Yabba-Dabba-Dopoulos would say, oh, quite ironic. Triggered much? Oh, jolly good show. Oh, Bob's your uncle. But during all of this, the organization is still relatively small, confined to a fraction of American colleges. And then SDS really came into its own with protests against the Vietnam War. That was really the absolute catalyst for the vast majority of 60s activism and the groups that came out of that. Without Vietnam, it's an entirely different country, and obviously in many ways. But the way that the 60s protest movement and radical organizations were shaped was hugely dependent upon Vietnam and what happened there. So throughout the mid-60s, SDS became the point people on a given college campus involved in any kind of anti-war protest. In 1965, there was a massive war demonstration in D.C., and the president of SDS at the time gave a great speech that was massively well respected, and that raised the profile of Students for a Democratic Society. So the late 60s, the mid to late 60s for SDS is basically this process by which the ferment of dissatisfaction and anger about the Vietnam War among college students contributed to this huge energy behind the sales of SDS, which made it grow larger, grow more chapters, get a higher profile in public, become more prominent in anti-war activism. But at the same time, that also increased the number of different types of people with the different number of conflicting agendas who began trying to join and ideally direct the movement of SDS. And so those two things sort of fed each other throughout that whole period. So 1968 is obviously a huge year, as it was. It's sort of the pivotal year of the 1960s. And it saw massive revolt, urban violence, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the race riots throughout almost all Northern American urban areas, and the demonstrations in Chicago, the police riot against protesters who didn't want to see Hubert Humphrey seize the Democratic nomination. So that also affected the SDS because it contributed to a sense of urgency and a sense of frustration with how nonviolent methods learned from the civil rights movement had failed to have the sort of equal effect on the war effort that it had on civil rights law. That led to a greater sense of urgency and anger and more pressure within SDS, which led towards, over the next couple of years, a split. And in 1969, SDS was essentially put into a prolonged crisis between two sides, and they had a bunch of petty arguments about which party, which is enter SDS, need to be barred from SDS, and which ones needed to be let in. All very petty, but all just proxies for the main conflict between an old guard who still saw their role as being part of a nonviolent, consciousness-raising, and solidarity-producing mechanism, which was the protest movement, and an emerging block of more radical, more ideological, and angrier people who felt like nonviolence had sort of reached the limits of its effectiveness, and something else had to be mooted, had to be thought of. And so that split carried itself out through 1969, and what emerged out of it at the annual convention was a final conflict which saw SDS essentially split into two sections, like the fucking Armageddon asteroid getting blown up by Bruce Willis and flying off into two hunks into the stratosphere. And the names and whatever don't really matter, but all that really matters is that one rump group of I guess you'd call them bourgeois pig sellouts or reformists or something, Kautskyites, continued the organization as a protest group, as an attempt to create educational outreach and to create connections between different organizations. So a civic society protest movement, which existed into the 80s, quietly to not a lot of public fuss. The other group, which called itself the Main Office, which basically claimed to be the actual real SDS as opposed to those fucking splitters, was eventually taken over by this group of ultra-radicals who decided that American fascism was too advanced, was too bloodthirsty, was too depraved to be dealt with by nonviolent resistance. It had to be met with force that would move America towards a point of radical class and race consciousness that would then create a civil war and the overthrow of the old order. That was the only thing that was going to do. That was the only thing that was going to stop the blood-streaked machinery of empire, was going to be a violent intercession. So there was a special publication of one of the SDS magazines was brought out during the 1969 convention, and it was called "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows," which was by this group of radicals in SDS who wanted to become violent. And it was a reference to the Bob Dylan song "Subterranean Homesick Blues," which has the line, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows," which is hilarious on a number of levels, because what was being created here was this group of radicals who felt that they were going to be the vanguard, the people who led the American and world proletariat to ultimate victory. But the weatherman in that song lyric is superfluous. You don't need him. And yet they called themselves that thing. And if they were French, maybe I would buy that was intentional irony, but these were really earnest nerds. So I kind of think they didn't realize what they were doing with that little goof. So anyway, 1969 was coming to an end with the creation of this radical group of young, white, pissed off, middle-class kids who wanted to end America's empire, end racism, and to an emerging extent within the group, end sexism. And they honestly felt that it was their duty as these people in the global cockpit of empire to do as much as all of the world liberation movements that they admired, like in Cuba and Vietnam had done, and China. If they could do it, my God, then you should do it here too. It's certainly our responsibility to do it here too. So The first real show of strength after the SDS split in summer of 1969 was in October, when the newly dubbed sort of Weather Underground staged a demonstration in Chicago, which had been the scene a year previously of the mayhem surrounding the Democratic National Convention. So the difference is that this was not going to be your grandpa's fucking protest. This was going to be the weathermen announcing to the world, to the proletariat, to the global anti-imperial forces, and to Uncle Charlie himself, that we were here and we were going to be playing for keeps now. It wasn't going to be going around in a circle on a predetermined path like in the marches on Washington or whatever. It was going to be anarchic, violent, and destructive, and it was going to cost things for the city. And it started with the bombing of the Haymarket Cop statue on October 6th. And then the real thing kicked off the next day when, in something that became known as the Days of Rage, 300 or so SDS people or weather people ran riot in downtown Chicago. Now, this was supposed to be the moment when the weathermen showed their strength to the world, to America, as a force in the streets, as a group who could command physical space in an urban environment and make the forces that be deal with them. But instead of that happening, about 800 people showed up. And when they saw how serious the cops were, this is over a year after the DNC, these guys knew how to crack hippie heads, fled. And so over the next 3 days of the Days of Rage, it was a small core of 300 hardcore motherfuckers who didn't run away and who threw shit at judges' houses and who broke windows all up and down the Miracle Mile of the shops and stuff in downtown Chicago, who fucking got into it and fucking threw hands with the cops, causing cop injuries and getting hurt themselves. And it was something that honestly showed their commitment. It didn't necessarily show their effectiveness, although even if it hadn't been a huge success in terms of galvanizing others, it certainly did show that things were changing and that the cost was going to be higher of these protests, which to them was a victory. So, inspired by what had happened, the leadership of the Weather Underground got together in Flint, Michigan that December and had something that became known later as the Flint War Council, where this group of leaders has decided that, you know what, maybe that protest shit doesn't work. You know, we did this thing in Chicago. It didn't really get us the result we wanted. We don't really have evidence to believe that if we call for an urban action, we're going to be supported by a critical mass of the population of that area, regardless of their physical condition or of how alienated they are from empire. So maybe what we need to do is fall back and do something that is even more violent and direct, but doesn't require control of physical space with large numbers of people the way that the protest strategy had meant. Essentially, they decided that they were going to go to war with the United States government. And one of the things that really made them decide to do that definitively was the death of Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was the incredibly charismatic, very young leader of the Black Panthers of Chicago, a guy who was able to articulate brilliantly the necessity for socialism, the necessity for multiracial solidarity in the face of capital, who saw through the mystifications of racism and classism and said, the way we're going to defeat this awful racial caste system is through multiracial democratic socialism that will destroy the need for this system of control. And he was largely opposed to violence. In fact, he condemned the Days of Rage as unnecessarily provocative. But he was also an effective evangelist for a radical change in America's political and economic structure in a way that could appeal to people who were in a different race, the same way that Martin Luther King had appealed to people multiracially with his incipient idea for a Poor People's March the year before Hashtag just saying. But the upshot of this is that the FBI essentially had Fred Hampton assassinated by the Chicago Police Department. He was in a home. He was in an apartment with a number of other members of the Black Panther Party and friends and family. Someone who was in the pay of the Chicago Police Department as an informant drugged his drink so that he was unconscious. And then Chicago police destroyed the entire apartment with bullets indiscriminately, killed another Black Panther named Mark Clark, and then, according to multiple witnesses, point blank executed Fred Hampton in his bed. And the Weather Underground took from this that, you know what? The only thing you motherfuckers understand is force. It's all we have, and it's all we can do to make you fucking pay attention. Because these attempts to actually create solidarity among Americans on a class level, it's too fucking dangerous. You're too quick to squash it. So now what ended up happening after the Flint War Council is that the leaders basically went underground. They were no longer publicly available. They started creating fake identities and fake identification cards, and were living in places without any kind of public knowledge of where they lived. And in so doing, began marshaling the forces for these small guerrilla bands, these essentially terrorist group hustles. And they were concentrated in the Midwest and then on each coast. And the big sort of coming out party for this new insurgency was on February 21st, 1970, when Molotov cocktails were thrown at the home of a New York State Supreme Court justice who was presiding over a court case involving 21 Black Panthers who were accused of terrorism or whatever. And they threw the Molotov cocktails into this motherfucker's house in New York City. And that really got the starter's pistol going. They were ready now to do spectacular public violence in an effort to rouse people's consciousness so that they would fight against this awful system. To that end, the next big plan was to blow up a NCO dance at Fort Dix. They were going to smuggle a bomb into this Army prom and blow it up as a way to signal to the country that the war machine of America had to be stopped at any fucking cost. But the people who were trying to do this were building this bomb in a townhouse in Greenwich Village when it blew up. And it destroyed this entire townhouse in Greenwich Village. It killed 3 Weather Underground people. And this was a huge shock to everybody. And this is when they really made the decision to go totally underground, to no longer have a public face, and to only do things from an insurgent perspective, and also to try to not kill people as much. Maybe there was some sort of, karma there. But anyway, they started to do very showy but non-lethal bombings in major areas across the country. So they put bombs all over the place. They put bombs at the New York City Police Department. They put bombs at Army and Naval recruiting offices. Most hilariously, they got paid by a bunch of weird acid freaks to break Timothy Leary out of prison, which they did successfully. And this ended up sparking a huge explosion of American political violence in the early 1970s. And it's kind of amazing to think about this, because we are in America totally fixated on fucking terrorism and really neurotically obsessed with the idea of public acts of violence like that. But there's basically no terror attacks in the United States in a given year. You can round it down to 0, basically. In 18 months, from 1971 to 1972, there were over 2,500 bombings in the United States. I mean, most of them they blew up a trash can in a bank bathroom or something. I mean, the most high profile bombing from this era that the weather people did was they blew up a woman's bathroom in the Pentagon. I mean, that's what most of them were. They were sort of small, almost ceremonial explosions in front of positions of power. But they killed very few people, and they were pretty small. People were usually notified ahead of time. But that's still a crazy number. I mean, think about how nuts everybody goes every time somebody finds a fucking pipe bomb in a mailbox, or some fucking dipshit fail-son has a botched attempt to, derail a fucking Amtrak with his dick or something. 2,500 bombings in 18 months. I mean, regardless of their size, that's going to be fucking anxiety-producing and weird to people. But it was that normal for that time. The most outlandish of these motherfuckers was probably the Symbionese Liberation Army, which was a white escaped con and a bunch of white nerds who kidnapped Patty Hearst and brainwashed her, or didn't, depending on sources, and did a number of bank robberies and even killed somebody. That all was sort of this part of this milieu that was sparked by basically the frustration of seeing the 60s protest movement gutter into nothingness and seeing nothing change and things, in fact, even getting worse, and feeling nothing but frustration at how that could be possible, and wanting to just do anything that one could to make it do something to this edifice of monstrosity that would make you feel like you were having an effect. So it's understandable. I mean, when you think about how horrifying the Vietnam War is, I mean, it's hard to really fathom, and it's totally been lost in history. Our only cultural versions of the Vietnam War mostly are about how it made the guys who did it, the men who carried out a fucking butchery in Southeast Asia, it made them feel sad. If you only watched American Vietnam War movies, you'd think that these guys were defending their frontier against rampaging invaders, instead of being in another country and just wantonly committing massacres, killing literally millions of people. And throughout the whole time that these guys were protesting peacefully, the war just kept expanding. Johnson kept adding more bombings, kept adding more troops. And then Nixon ran on a promise to end the war. He had a secret fucking plan to end the war. And what happened? He got in there and he expanded the war. A secret bombing in Cambodia. And then when people started getting pissed, students were massacred in Kent State and Jackson State. There was no real feeling that you could change anything without the only language that this sort of monstrous power understood, which was violence. So that's the milieu. And America's racial horror show. Segregation was over as a matter of law, but its effects lingered with no real effort to try to correct them, and awfulness. And every time somebody tried to stand up for them, like Fred Hampton, they were literally murdered, or Martin Luther King murdered. And just a sense that nothing was getting better on any front, that we'd reached this, we'd hit the absolute limit, and reaction was coming into our faces and just destroying our ability to create anything better. That we were only going to go backward from now on. That frustration is understandable. And so these people channeled it into this violence. The most famous of them were Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, who emerged sort of out of general amnesty in the early 80s to say, hey, we're no longer underground. We're no longer doing violence. It didn't work. We did all these bombings. They didn't really change anything. We're pretty tired. We'd like to go back to the bourgeois, professional lives that we had coming to us when we were in college before we decided to do this. And they got away, and then they eventually they got off, and they eventually settled into cushy academic jobs and were neighbors of Barack Obama and Felix Biederman, for that matter, in Chicago, which ended up being a hilarious little fill-up to the 2008 campaign. Obama was accused of palling around with terrorists. And you know what? It didn't really have any effect, for largely because the reason that by that point, 60s radicals were sort of cute. They were adorable. I mean, they were recognizably different from the sort of other represented by Islamic terrorism after 9/11. They were kind of cute. They were like tie-dyed, It's like, oh, look at these little guys. So it didn't have any effect. But anyway, the reason these people, even though they were responsible for numerous bombings and had done tons of illegal stuff, most of them got off with very light sentences, mostly probation, maybe a fine, when they came out of underground hiding in the late 70s, early 80s. And the main reason for that is that this case that the feds would have been able to present to a jury, most of the evidence they would have presented would have exposed the fact that during this period, they were doing warrantless wiretaps and home invasions on people. We're sending in agents provocateurs to provoke violence and crime in order to discredit movements. We're opening mail illegally. We're doing a whole host of radically unconstitutional acts to interdict the emerging the emerging radical movement. And this all really blew up when the COINTELPRO papers were found by some heroes who raided a regional FBI office and found these documents, which proved that the FBI was doing all of this. And so to have them go to court and charge these weather people, if they were going to present evidence, that evidence would have been tainted with these methods, these unconstitutional methods, which would have only opened these agencies up for more scrutiny and perhaps even prosecution. So these guys, for the most part, got off lightly because they were being pursued illegally, which is sort of the secret thread that runs through the decay of the New Left. I mean, we can talk about, and we will talk about, how the New Left was sort of flawed in a way that was going to undermine its effectiveness no matter what, but it sure as hell didn't help that you had every organization infiltrated with informants and agent provocateur, all of them with the mission of undermining these organizations' ability to function, the effect that people were unable to trust one another at any level, and groups just split and split and split, and that was all at the behest of these government agencies that were undermining these legitimate political movements in the United States. So the ones who didn't give up in the late 70s, the dead enders, there was a group who decided, no, we're not going to come back up, because the split between people who gave themselves up and those who stayed was basically on the question of, well, maybe we should come up and try to form an actual political party. We haven't been able to radicalize people at the grassroots. We haven't been able to generate the sort of energy we thought we could through spectacular violence. Maybe we need to go back to old-fashioned party building. And of course, hey, if we get to no longer be on the run and live in bands and always be hiding out for the cops, and we get to relax a little bit and strike a deal with the government so that we don't go to jail, hey, that's good too, right? And some of them said, fuck you, we're not going to do that. They stayed out there. And in fact, in the 1980s, there was a fucking Brinks robbery in Massachusetts where a bunch of this group of weathermen and these members of the Black Liberation Front, which was sort of an Afro-communist party group, got together to rob a Brinks truck. And then there was a massive shootout afterward that killed 3 people, including a cop. And that was basically the most violent episode connected to any of these groups, basically. The most violent single moment. And those guys went to jail, obviously, because they were able to connect them to this actual crime as opposed to convicting for these basically political crimes that would have been stitched up from informant testimony and the results of provocations. In fact, the most interesting trial to come out of this whole shenanigan is that Mark Felt, a high-level FBI officer, was charged criminally in the late 70s for authorizing illegal wiretaps and home invasions. And Richard Nixon's first public appearance after Watergate was to testify on his behalf to say that presidents going back to Roosevelt were authorizing all this stuff, or Kennedy were authorizing all this stuff, and it was basically privilege of office, and you shouldn't prosecute someone for carrying out an order. And Felt was convicted. He ended up having his conviction pardoned by Reagan. But the irony, of course, is that Mark Felt, according to recent revelations from Woodward and Bernstein and his family, was fucking Deep Throat. He was the guy who basically helped destroy the Nixon presidency, and Nixon fucking ended up unbeknowingly testifying for him. That is actually ironic. That is a literal irony. I mean, I can't think of anything more perfectly ironic than that. Anyway, so that is the anticlimactic story of the Weather Underground. We have to judge them by their works, and in so doing, there is nothing to be said but that they were a colossal failure. At no point did they ever create the sort of generalized protest movement, resistance movement that they dreamed they could. Never happened. Their violence ended up redounding to no one's benefit. There's a lot of people who say that they totally undermined and fucked up the left. Other people say that they provided a inspiration for some more militant urban elements. I don't honestly know. My guess is it was probably counterproductive. But, I mean, the fact is they were reacting to the reality, which was that the trajectory of the left by the late 60s was very much in doubt. There was no more momentum going forward after all of the huge breakthroughs in the middle of the decade. It was petering out. Reaction was coming back full force. So in that respect, you understand their desire to do that. But they didn't succeed. And we can evaluate their motives in two ways. One is the way that I've already said, that the frustration and real bone-deep horror at what America was perpetrating at home and abroad was too much, and that they were morally right to do what they were doing. But there was another part of it, too, which is that they were essentially self-centered in that what they really cared about was absolving themselves of responsibility for what their country was doing. And they've said this, like if you look at the Weather Underground documentary that was done a few years ago, interviews with them, is that they say this outright, which is that they say, not doing anything would have made me complicit. Not doing anything would have made me as much of a criminal, as much of a perpetrator of violence as anyone in the Pentagon. I have a moral responsibility to stop this. But what that really means is that you're saying that what matters more than anything is that my personal conscience is clear, that my actions absolve me. Not that I actually affect change. That is second to the main point of absolving oneself from personal responsibility. And that certainly speaks to that generation's emerging self-fixation, the idea that there's some sort of special meaning imbued in the one's self-perception, and that maintaining a high self-perception is key to advancing in the world successfully or meaningfully or satisfyingly. And that is less commendable, more greedy. But I'd say that the main failing of them, the main failure of the Weather Underground and the SDS before them, was that they were not connected in any way to a broader class movement. They were middle-class college kids at the end of the day. And that cut them off in a critical way from any kind of broader effect. Their violence was always going to be idiosyncratic and personal. It was always going to be evaluated by other people and by their hoped-for proletarian audience as a personalized act, something that didn't connect to them in any meaningful way, because they didn't make those connections. They attempted to. There were these efforts called jailbreaks, where they tried to recruit members by going to high schools and basically telling the kids, this is a conformity factory. You're being turned into a willing servant of empire. You're turning into a slave. You need to break out of this jail. Come with us. Very alienating, had very little effect, got very few members that way. There were other efforts too, but nothing ever coalesced into conduits to these communities they were trying to reach. Black communities in the inner cities and poor whites and workers everywhere. They never made that connection. And so their violence, their actions, no matter what they were, had no resonance beyond their individual lives. And while you might blame them for not recognizing that, for suffering from that enthusiastic, youthful student myopia that tells you that what's right in front of you is the most important thing in the world and the only thing that matters, and I'm going to move towards this goal with all of the passion and blood in my body, which is understandable, but it means you miss the bigger picture. So I don't know if we can blame them for that, but we certainly have to acknowledge that it was a failure to not recognize it. And what they were failing to recognize is the fundamental challenge of the left in the post-war era. All right, so I actually made this point in an episode of Chapo from very nearly beginning of the show. Some of you might not have heard of it, others you might have forgotten about it. But either way, I really feel like I want to expand on this idea a little more. And it's that if we're going to look at America through a lens of class, which we have to do if we want to evaluate its reception, its receptiveness to change, because class is the motor of history. I mean, I'm sorry, you can disagree, but that's fine. That's what Marx said. It's been, I think, confirmed. I think it's unarguable is that is the magma. That's the magma that moves the tectonic plates as class. If you think that, and you think that evaluating a social structure for its amenability to change depends on analyzing its class structure, then the most fruitful comparison of the post-war American quote-unquote working class is to, if we look back to the Marxist categories that Marx created in his life, which were all of times well before the advanced capitalism and industrialism and post-industrialism of the United States came into being. The categories he was familiar with, the one that American people post-war most resemble, is none of the ones in his understanding when he breaks down what a working class is. None of the urban working classes that he talks about as the people who are going to overthrow capitalism. None of them. It is a reactionary class that he talks about in his book, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, the French peasantry, the French small-holding peasantry. I feel like of the categories that Marx was able to observe and sketch, post-war Americans most resemble the French peasantry of the 1840s. And that is for the reason of the way that class comes into consciousness. So this is the quote that is often referenced by people who want to make some argument that Marx hated farmers or some shit, when the context of it is that he's not criticizing farmers by calling them this. He is merely using a comparison to show the way that class operates in their lives. But anyway, this is a famous quote from the 18th Brumaire, describing the peasants who had voted in the presidential election to elect Louis Napoleon, Napoleon's dipshit fail nephew, as president. And Marx, breaking down all the classes who were on the different sides of the French political scene after the February Revolution of 1848, the question is left, well, why did all these peasants, these workers really, these people who depended on the market and who had foes with it and who were exploited, how did they ratify this bourgeois reactionary? And this is his way of explaining it. The smallholding peasants form an immense mass whose members live in similar conditions but without entering into manifold relations with each other. Their mode of production isolates them from one another instead of bringing them into mutual intercourse. The isolation is furthered by France's poor means of communication and the poverty of the peasants. Their field of production, the smallholding, permits no division of labor in its cultivation, no application of science, and therefore no multifariousness of development, no diversity of talent, no wealth of social relationships. Each individual peasant family is almost self-sufficient, directly produces most of its consumer needs, and thus acquires its means of life more through an exchange with nature than an intercourse with society. A smallholding, the peasant and his family, beside it another smallholding, another peasant, and another family. A few score of these constitute a village, and a few score villages constitute a department. Thus, the great mass of the French nation is formed by the simple addition of synonymous magnitudes, much as potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. So what Marx is saying there should be pretty clear. He's saying that the way that class consciousness emerges is not by people reading, it's not by people spontaneously coming to the understanding that socialism is the future, it's by experience. They labor, they are exploited, they suffer, they are discontent by this, they are alienated from themselves and their labor by this. And this experience creates consciousness because it is shared by thousands of other people in your immediate vicinity, hundreds to thousands, people who are suffering the same indignities, the same alienation, and thus are able to confirm with one another the same diagnosis and come together to say, we want to change this. We understand that our enemies are the people making us do this. Our enemies are the people forcing us to do this. Our enemies are the one extracting profit from our labor while doing nothing themselves. And they work together, but they also live together. They're in these tightly packed working class suburbs in Paris and in inner cities and other European capitals. So they wake up together, they go work together, they come back to the neighborhoods, they drink together, they compare experiences, and that experience makes them all realize at some point, what the fuck? What are these motherfuckers doing to us? It's the point where Marx says in another writing that a class goes from being a class in itself to a class for itself. A class that just isn't a constituted group, but a constituted group that is self-aware, that understands its predicament and has rightly identified its enemies, its fucking boss. The one guy who pulls the fucking whistle at the beginning of the day, marches everybody into the factory, marches them out at the end of the night, and collects all the money from all the labor. That's the enemy. That's what working in those conditions does. Peasants didn't have that experience. Peasants work on their land. For the most part, they only work with their immediate family. 19th century concepts would never have imagined that, like, making your kid or your wife do work on your farm constitutes exploitation. It's part of the family unit or whatever. So class relations don't exist. Class conflict doesn't exist. Their neighbors are not in view. They don't see them every day. They don't interact with them. They don't bond over shared experiences the same way. They live isolated lives. It's something that Marx called the rural idiocy of life in a farm. And they don't have a antagonist. Their antagonist and also their sort of lover is nature. The nature can destroy them. Nature can raise them up. And that's really the fight to sort of get nature on their side that dominates their intellectual concept of antagonism. It's nature. They take the goods to market, but the price is set elsewhere. It's mystified. Their experience with the soil and the sun and the rain, that's real. And that is their world. And that means that they're not going to grow class consciousness. They don't have horizontal social relationships. They only have family relationships. Their understanding of the world around them is not created by interaction with people within their vicinity. It's hierarchical, vertical relationships with the church and the state in the form of almost legendary folk wisdom and stuff, and nothing that came from neighbors specifically. Like, you're not thinking of people, you're thinking of a concept of a state, and more importantly of a church, certainly during the feudal period. Less so during the modern one, but still strong in the countryside, in the sense that your relationship is with God, your relationship with his state in the form of the king or the archbishop or someone who stands in for God. It's all up. It's all looking up. None of it's looking to the side. It's all looking up. Those are your social relationships. And so when it was time to vote for a president after the 48 revolution drove off the July monarchy, the answers to these political questions can't be found from experience, can't be found from intercourse, as Marx would call it, with fellow members of your class. It could only come from folk memory. The last moment for these people in the mid 1800s, these older people, the last time that they could remember France being in its apogee of being great was during Napoleon's reign. And even those who were too young to experience it certainly heard the tales of French glory. So when someone is on the ballot with that name, that magical name, Napoleon, how else are you going to make your decision? Why wouldn't you choose to make France great again with this mystical name, this name that connects to something? It's the only name on this ballot that connects to something. Everything else is abstract. They're just words on a page that have no experience, that have no connection to your life. This has a connection to the life of you, or if you remember Napoleon, or your father if you remember Napoleon, of your neighbors when you speak of Napoleon, when you do speak, and your family, and then you have a picture of him or something. That means something. And so they voted for Napoleon, the name that meant something to them, because they didn't have another way of understanding politics. Now, obviously, post-war American subject is not in any way the same situation. Our connection to the land was severed generations ago. Our contact with agriculture is totally through the barriers of of currency and processing and capitalism. There is no connection to anything you could even remotely call natural for most of us. It is a simulated, abstracted world. But we are isolated and moved away from horizontal interaction in the same way that those French peasants were. After World War II, after the largesse generated by being the hyperpower with the only manufacturing capability that was intact after World War II, when that magnificence would spread across this burgeoning white middle class, Americans were basically dispersed to the winds in suburbs. So suburbanization cast people from these tightly knit workers' neighborhoods, these urban workers' neighborhoods, because that is such a key to class consciousness as Marx understood it. And the thing is that this was something that he basically anticipated, because a lot of the class categories that Marx talked about in 1848 had not yet really come into view in Europe. In a lot of the Industrial Revolution was highly advanced in some parts of Europe, like the UK, but not in others, and it was not evenly sparsed out. So he was anticipating this. But by the end of that century, the end of the 19th century, after he had died, you really saw that the reality of having mass industrial production was the people came together into these communities. The suburbs in Paris that are now these seething immigrant belts were called, at this period, the Red Belt. It was just this belt of neighborhoods that all voted communist, and were not to be persuaded on the political question, who understood things. And that was just par for the course in Europe, these tightly compacted red neighborhoods. But those were broken up by housing policy after World War II. People were scattered to the winds of these suburbs with the quarter-acre lot and the separation from one another. And you were either broken up geographically or you were isolated geographically by racism, by this maniacal need to quarantine black people, most of whom were workers, from everyone else. So barriers were thrown up racially and geographically across the country. So that was the beginning of it. After World War II was this spreading out, this geographic separation that separated everybody from each other. And then the other thing that came in that Marx obviously could never have anticipated was mass media, because just as these tendrils of suburbia are being thrown out from every major city, just as walls are going up to ensure that black and minority workers are ghettoized, also all those homes are being filled with televisions and the culture the television creates, which obliterates the old animal spiritual need to just be out and amongst other people, to be out amongst people who you are not seeing every day, people who give your life variety and change. Well, you don't need that anymore. There's a fucking box in your living room that will give that to you and will present you with a unified ideological framework. Like all art will comport to this narrow spectrum of capitalist ideology. And so those two forces, media and geography, start the process by which people, this unified working class or white working class, because that was part of the grim deal of American racial hierarchy, started to break up. And then it was exacerbated in the coming years by the fact that even the working conditions that Marx talked about, where hundreds of people were in a factory together, those were broken up. Factories were cast off into smaller areas so that they were less important to the supply chain, but in reality, less vulnerable to a mass shutdown. So first they were scattered into the winds, these factories, into areas with less robust labor laws, for example, in the South. And then when liberalization happened in the 70s, across into lower union density and lower standard of living countries. And so those workplaces, the old shop floors, the fucking shop floors where the Petersburg Soviet was born, they were gone. And in their place was a patchwork of retail and service industry and smaller workplaces with fewer employees interacting with each other at a given time. More turnover, so less time to make connections with people. So those forces over the years have created a situation where those horizontal social relationships, which built class consciousness in the old working class urban neighborhoods, was broken up and replaced with the old French peasant vertical relationship. Because you're once again with your family, broken away, inwardly focused. I'm sure that some of those French peasants, their small hold wasn't much bigger than the acreage of a nice suburban home in Long Island or something, in Levittown. So you're back to that. You're back to that geographic separation from your fellow. I mean, you don't work there, but you work somewhere else where you only interact with people, and then you're back and you're never seeing them again. You're not walking back to the same neighborhood the way you were with the people you worked with in the factories in the years before. So now you're broken up in that same way. And once again, your only way to even imagine that you're living in a community or in a country with a shared value system and history and vocabulary is through media, television, movies, the internet. This is how you know that you're in America. This is how you know that America is anything. This is how you have a vocabulary to talk about America, is by that vertical relationship to mediated concepts and media figures. It can't be stressed enough the degree to which politics and culture in America are personalized, because we don't have concepts to talk about things because we don't have shared experiences that can lead us to conclusions. We only have things brought from above, sort of dropped on our heads. And they come in these forms born by these recurring visages, these brands, and these people. And so we relate to them as these givers, essentially a cultural cargo cult. And so these are the people who tell us things. And so we relate to politics on a purely personal level. I mean, much has been made about how there's no ideological consistency between the people who hated Obama and loved Trump, the people who hated this gay Muslim but loved this fancy, flighty, queeny New York real estate kibitzer, and decide that he's an alpha male. I mean, how does that happen? It happens because none of these categories mean anything other than our ability to impress upon symbols that are embodied by people. Like that's why that's why the left reform movement in America is honestly in trouble once fucking Bernie Sanders dies, because yes, he would, when Bernie showed up in the 16 election, he was showing up at a time when people were ready to hear a socialist message, but they needed someone to put those feelings into, and Bernie was the vessel. He was this old slovenly guy, direct, blunt, to the point. It wasn't just that he was saying the things that people could relate to, it's that he presented himself in a way that felt authentic. And even if there were 15 senators and 100 congresspeople who had Bernie's exact record and beliefs, if they didn't have his presentation of authenticity, they will be less appealing to voters and to Americans. And so anybody that comes after Bernie, unless he's a fucking clone, is going to have he's going to have less authenticity, and so he's going to be less appealing to voters because people can only relate at that symbolic level. They have no other language to talk about politics or understand it. And of course, this is why in 2016, enough Americans were able to look at the grasping, bloated, horrific, monstrous visage of Donald Trump and be like, you know what? Fuck it, go for it. Because that's what only understanding the world through these celebrity avatars will lead you to. A guy shows up, you see him your entire life on television as this figure of massive success and awesomeness and total fucking ownage. This guy who cuts his way through life without giving a shit, gets whatever he wants, bosses everybody around. How would you not see him and say, yes, this is the man to lead us out of these doldrums? Because what else do you have? It's the way that the French peasants looked at Louis Napoleon and thought of the fucking empire. You look at Trump, or these people looked at Trump, and they saw a life that was like what they saw on TV. So that is why I say that while the French peasants of the mid-1800s that Marx talked about were potatoes in a sack, these natural things pulled from the earth and still covered with loam thrown into a bag, we are similar but different in the sense that we are the potatoes pulled from the earth, but then peeled, diced, processed, adulterated, reconfigured, fried, stacked mechanically, placed into the same isolation from each other, but in a rigidly mechanical form, the way that we come into the world fundamentally incapable of relating to nature the way that these French peasants did, changed deeply by our relationship to technology and media. So we are not potatoes in a sack. We are instead Pringles in a tube. And the SDS was always fighting against this current, always trying to reknit these connections that have been severed. And were never able to do it. And part of that is because they were a bunch of dipshit middle-class college kids. But the other part of it is because those severing of ties is the most salient issue that exists on the American left. It is the signal challenge of those who seek to build some sort of consensus around change, around overcoming the savage limitations of capitalism, saving the earth and saving humanity. This question of breaking up those chips into something different is the one that should be all in the front of all of our minds whenever we think of how the hell we're going to get out of this. All right. Well, that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed yourself. I had a good time. I'll talk to you dudes on the flippity flop.